9715.
Welcome again to another episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. We appreciate you joining us over and over for your weekly dose of creepy here at the home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts,
Sarah Jones
and Samantha Carter. Make sure and hit that subscribe button for whichever app you listen from, and don't forget to leave a rating and a review. Hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and make sure you check out our website, www.bigfootforbreakfast.com. Those are just a few of the ways that you can get to know us better or contact us. You can also send us an email at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com or leave us a voicemail or a text at 641-812-2635. This week's episode is a continuation of a series we've decided to dedicate January of 2021 to, in the spirit of government conspiracy and political scandal and controversy. If you haven't been following the last few episodes, the topic of the month is the Kennedy-Camelot era. So far, we've covered Ted Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. This week, we continue down the rabbit hole discussing Marilyn Monroe and her alleged entanglement with the Kennedy clan.
But let's start at the beginning. Norma Jean Mortensen was born in Los Angeles, California on June 1st, the year 1926. A few fun facts. Also in June of that year, the College Board administered the first SAT, which most of us know to be standardized testing for university and college admission here in the good old USA.
Suck-ass test. What was that movie?
That was a good movie.
The Perfect Score.
Yeah. Anyway, also this year, the silent film The Great Gatsby, based on the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, was released by Paramount. So that's cool, right? Anyway, Norma's mother, Gladys Pearl Monroe, later Baker, was unmarried when she gave birth to her daughter. She had worked as a film cutter at a Hollywood editing studio and had two other children, Bernice and Robert.
One document called him Jackie, so I'm not sure if that was a nickname or if there was some controversy over what the name was, but he kind of is interchangeable as Robert or Jackie.
These two had been taken by her abusive ex-husband, John Newton Baker, during their divorce in 1923, although she had been awarded full custody. It sounds like John kidnapped the children, whisking them off to his native state, Kentucky. So John and Gladys had been married when she was 15 and he was 24.
After her divorce, she had a brief second marriage to a man named Mortensen, and it's still undetermined if he had fathered her third child. Gladys was on her own, struggling to support herself and her child while struggling with, at the same time, undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. Due to this, Norma Jean was placed in a foster home, but was frequently visited by her mother, who seemed to struggle with the idea of another person raising her child. In 1934, Gladys had a bit of a breakdown and found herself confined in an asylum after the discovery of the death of her 13-year-old son, who died from kidney disease. Between the years of 1935 and 1942, I want to go back and say, I think at the point where she ended up institutionalized, there was an incident where she had gone to the home of Norma Jean's foster parent, where she was staying with a knife and threatened her, and they were friends, so this was out of character for her, but she was trying to take Norma Jean back. But considering the time and her being a single female, it was really kind of unseemly of her to raise her kid by herself. Anyway, between the years of 1935 and 1942, Norma Jean bounced around from foster home to foster home, having been placed in 12 total and also in an orphanage at one point. During this time, she was the victim of multiple instances of sexual abuse when she was as young as 11 years old.
You see, I was brought up, I think, differently than the average American child. Because, no, but the average American child sort of, like to be happy, to be happy, that's it. Gee, happiness wasn't anything I ever took for granted. I loved to play. I didn't like the world around me too much, because it was kind of grim.
When the family who had legal guardianship of 15-year-old Norma Jean were moving to West Virginia, and the foster laws prevented her from leaving the state, They had to come up with a new plan for Norma Jean, but they didn't want her to have to return to the foster care system. As fate had it, the neighbors who had lived across the street had a son, James, who was 21 years old and started working at the nearby Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. They got along well, had a brief courtship, and in June of 1942, barely over 2 weeks after Norma Jean's 16th birthday, the couple were married. Shortly after James joined the Navy and was stationed in Catalina Island, after a year of marriage, the couple were back in Van Nuys, California when he was shipped right back out. His absence caused a strain in the marriage, and she, of course, was not content to settle for the life of a simple housewife. She took a job in a radio plane factory during the war, and it was there that she met a photographer, began doing some modeling, and she was signed to Blue Book Modeling Agency, where she began gaining some notoriety.
Of course, the next logical step forward for a woman with aspirations of fame is to screen test for film. She took that opportunity with 20th Century Fox, and she nailed it. They were willing to overlook the fact that she was entirely inexperienced. They agreed to sign her to a contract, as long as she was not married. That was a stipulation that Norma Jean was willing to concede to. Despite her husband trying to convince her against making the choice, after just 4 years of marriage, the two were divorced. Thus, Marilyn Monroe was born, and she signed a $125 a week, 1-year contract with the studio. Would you trade your husband for fame?
No, but that's because I don't like fame, and I'm a fly under the radar kind of girl. You know? How about you?
Probably not.
I'm not into being front and center.
I like money though.
Yeah. I don't like it that much. It really screws up people's lives when they get all famous.
Yeah, it does.
As this story will show you.
True.
So even though she had finally reached her goal in her professional life, her personal life was still on the rocks. In 1946, the year she divorced her husband, her mother was released from the hospital and her sister Bernice came to stay with them for a visit. Her mother, though deemed healthy enough to be discharged, was obviously not healthy and had a strong distaste for her daughter's choice in career. In September of that year, her mother abruptly took off, stating that she was going to go live with an aunt in Oregon. She never made it to Oregon, however. Instead, she married a man named John Stuart Ely, who apparently had another wife and family in Idaho. Just as well, I guess. It suited her and the studio PR just fine to report that both of her parents were dead. She did continue to send her mother money to help support her every month. Unfortunately, during her first year contracted with Fox Studios, she didn't appear in a single film, and her contract was not renewed. Luckily for her, they weren't her only option.
Of course, with fame comes drama and rumor and scandal. In 1948, Monroe was hired by Columbia Pictures and featured in the films Ladies of the Chorus, where, according to rumor, and the man himself, she met and had a brief affair with the comedian Milton Berle. Officially, he was dating film star Adele Jurgens at the time, who was also in the film. In his autobiography, he said of Monroe, quote, "Marilyn was on the climb in Hollywood, but there was nothing cheap about her. She wasn't one of those starlets around town that you could put one meal into and then throw into the sack. Maybe she didn't know exactly who she was, but she did know that she was worth something. She had respect for herself. Marilyn was a lady," end quote. This affair could have been somewhat problematic, as rumors were also in the wind that Monroe had a questionable relationship with her drama coach, Natasha Lattès. Monroe's dependence on Lattès was so intense she would refuse to film scenes without her coach nearby. They were inseparable both on and off set, which raised a few eyebrows. Monroe was once quoted as saying, "She was a great teacher, but she got really jealous about the men I saw. She thought she was my husband," about Lattès. Although this wasn't the only reported same-sex affair that Marilyn was rumored to have had. In 1954, her autobiography, she wrote, "A man who had kissed me once had said it was very possible that I was a lesbian, because apparently I had no response to males. I didn't contradict him because I didn't know what I was. Now, having fallen in love, I knew what I was. It wasn't a lesbian." I wouldn't say that quote necessarily denies ever having dabbled, so who knows about the other rumors.
You've read there was some actor that once said about me that kissing me was like kissing Hitler. Well, I think that's, his problem. And if I really have to do intimate love scenes with an individual who really has these kind of feelings towards me, then my fantasy can come into play. In other words, out with him, in with somebody else. There's somebody else there.
According to her filmography list in her biography on Britannica.com, in 1950, Monroe played a small, uncredited role in The Asphalt Jungle and had an appearance in All About Eve, which won her a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox. And she then appeared in The Fireball, Let's Make It Legal, Love Nest, As Young as You Feel, Clash by Night, Monkey Business, Don't Bother to Knock, We're Not Married, Full House, and Niagara. With these films, she gained a ton of recognition, but she still had a bit of a cross to bear. As it came out in the press in 1952 that her mother was in fact not dead and working in a nursing home outside of Los Angeles. This wasn't the only PR nightmare that she had to face at the time, as the Hollywood mandatory nude photo resurfacing also struck her that year. It was a minor hiccup, though, because her appearance in the 1953 films Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire that really pushed her to stardom. Despite her huge success in the spotlight and her obvious talent, she is said to have struggled with performance anxiety so severe that it would make her physically ill before going on set. She was almost infamous for being late to set, which really pissed off her co-stars and the film crew, as a result of her struggles with this anxiety and insecurity about her performances.
On January 14, 1954, in a quiet City Hall ceremony, Marilyn Monroe was married to none other than the Yankee Clipper, recently retired Joe DiMaggio, who had been labeled the greatest baseball player of all time. In her memoir, My Story, Monroe had told author Ben Heck, "The truth is, we were very much alike, as they both had dreams of stable family, life, and children." She said, "My publicity, like Joe's greatness, is something on the outside. It has nothing to do with what we actually are." In Dinner with DiMaggio, Memories of an American Hero, author Rock Positano wrote that DiMaggio described physical intimacy with Monroe as epic. Quote, "When we got together in the bedroom, it was like the gods were fighting. There were thunderclouds and lightning above us." Well then.
Of course, their marriage was a struggle from the beginning, with her career blossoming and him struggling with her public image. The same year they got married, the film There's No Business Like Show Business was released, and then The 7-Year Itch was released in 1955. Apparently, during the filming, DiMaggio was disgusted with the subway grate scene, which is an image that is definitely infamous. According to Monroe, he told her, quote, "Exposing my legs and thighs, even my crotch, that was the last straw." A mere 9 months after they had joined in marriage, Monroe tearfully and publicly announced their divorce.
Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio are presently having domestic difficulties. All I can say as her attorney is that, Freddie, this is what we would say with the conflict of careers.
Shortly after that announcement, DiMaggio wrote a letter to Monroe expressing his regret, stating, quote, "I love you and I want to be with you. There's nothing I like better than to restore your confidence in me. My heart split wide, even wider, seeing you cry in front of all those people." End quote. The divorce filing cited mental cruelty on the part of DiMaggio. I'm sure there was plenty more to the story, as he was rumored to be quite jealous. There were also some whispers of physical abuse.
So I was watching the video of them doing the announcement of her divorce, and her lawyer was doing all the talking, and she was just sitting there bawling. It was really sad.
After The 7-Year Itch, Monroe decided she was done being typecast the beautiful dumb blonde. She broke her contact with Fox, moved to New York City, and studied at the Actors Studio with Lee and Paula Strasberg, to whom she'd been introduced in 1955 by Cheryl Crawford, a producer-director who was one of the founding members of the Actors Studio. She had confided in Crawford that she wanted to develop her dramatic skills, and Crawford insisted that she meet Strasberg. Strasberg had been the artistic director for the Actors Studio since 1948. He was known for his highly disciplined approach to acting based on the teachings of Konstantin Stanislavski. I feel like it's relevant to include for those who really don't know that this Russian teacher encouraged actors to use his or her own past experiences and inner feelings to try to experience the emotions that the character will go through during the course of the play. Strasberg pushed the concept further, encouraging his students to not just act the role, but to become the character. After working with her privately for a few months, she was allowed to take regular classes at the Actors Studio, and it sounds like she flourished. Ultimately, she ended up saying goodbye to her longtime drama coach, Lytess, who we spoke about earlier, and Lytess was pretty bitter about it.
Throughout the intense training she received in New York, she continued to struggle with her own identity and image as Marilyn Monroe, and struggled as well with insomnia. She was at her peak, and after the success of The 7-Year Itch, Fox pulled out all the stops and made every concession to get her to sign a fourth and final contract with 20th Century Fox on December 31st, 1955. Her salary was boosted to $100,000 per film. She fought for and won cinematographer approval as well as story and director approval. She was also allowed to make films with independent producers as well as other studios. This amount of creative control was considered revolutionary for an actor at that time. More so, I would imagine, for an actress.
So at this point, I feel like we should backtrack a little bit and discuss the Actors Studio, which seems to have some roots in the group theater. The group theater had come to be well known for its support of leftist politics, and a few former members of this group theater were summoned to the House Un-American Activities Committee in the early 1950s and were accused of having communist ties. Many of those group theater members were well known to a playwright named Arthur Miller. One of his most familiar plays is Death of the Salesman, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. In 1956, Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe were married. Also, 1 year and 4 days after they were wed, Arthur was brought to testify before this House committee on Un-American Activities. He was charged with contempt of Congress for his defiance of McCarthyism and refusal to name suspected communists. He was denied a passport and sentenced to a $500 fine or 30 days in jail. He was not your typical everyday plead the fifth uncooperative witness, though. Instead, Miller cited the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech and, by implication, the right to remain silent. In the end, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned his conviction.
Also in that year, Monroe starred in the film Bus Stop and briefly retired from movie making. As a consequence of marrying Miller, she became a subject of interest to the FBI. However, it doesn't sound like her left-leaning political ideas began with her affiliation with him. Lois Banner, author of a 2012 biography, expressed that she believes Monroe was never called before the committee because the anti-communist congressman, quote, thought she was just a dumb blonde. It could be speculated that her humble beginnings helped her to develop her progressive views on the matter of race and other controversial political topics. She did not hide her support for the then burgeoning civil rights movement. Diving into the FBI archives, we found a memo that a reporter, whose name is blacked out of course, from the New York Daily News, who had reported to the FBI that he had received a phone call from an anonymous male source telling him that, quote, Arthur Miller has been and still is a member of the Communist Party and was their cultural frontman. The memo goes on to state that, quote, the caller said that Miller's religious marriage ceremony to actress Marilyn Monroe and Miller's public statements were so much cover-up. According to the anonymous caller, Marilyn Monroe had drifted into the communist orbit, and money from Marilyn Monroe Productions was finding its way into the Communist Party. The source stated that Marilyn Monroe Productions was filled with communists. The information in this memo was received second or third hand and was considered suitable for general information only, as noted in the memo.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal: providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
There are multiple other memos related to Marilyn Monroe's productions, specifically naming her as president and Milton Green as vice president. The memos continue giving all known information about Milton Green: when he was born, when he was married, who he was married to, his previous employment. One memo we found in the FBI declassifieds dated 4/27/1956 reference a letter to the FBI director that lists this information, including in 1944 when Green became president of Baum and Green Incorporated. In in 1948 when he became president of Milton Green Corporation and the address of said business, as well as his and Monroe's residential address. The memo also names Irving F. L. Stein as an officer of the company and gives similar information about him, including the address at which he was at the time practicing as an attorney. Sam Greengold was also listed as a former secretary-treasurer of the production company prior to his death in September of 1951.
They know everything about The FBI documents report that there is not a complete list of officers for that organization available. New Haven and Los Angeles offices are requested to continue searching for information on subversive activity of Milton Green. Lee B. Green, who is a medical doctor at Bellevue Hospital in New York, as well as the brother of Milton Green, is also named in this list, but his position or other affiliation with the company is not specified. I think he was just on the watch list for association.
Despite her temporary retirement from film after her marriage to Artie Miller in 1956, she did co-star with Lawrence Oliver in The Prince and the Showgirl in 1957.
Thank goodness.
But her business venture and personal relationship with Milton Green, the VP of MMP, was rapidly failing on mutual terms regarding resentments about the problems during production of The Prince and the Showgirl. Green and Monroe's husband, Arthur Miller, detested each other and put her in the middle. Of course, her company and relationship with Green would suffer as she felt that she needed to keep her loyalty to her husband over everything else. Miller pushed her to take control away from Green, and Green was condescending toward Artie at every turn. Hating that he held so much sway over her and by extension the company and her films, by this time Marilyn was seeing an analyst, or a psychoanalyst, up to 5 days per week. Her mood swings were tumultuous, and rumor has it that she was overindulging on her medications.
It's apparent in many of her interviews that she struggled very much with a separation of self. She herself as one person, and the actress and sex symbol as a completely different person. She was trying to put aside the glamour and face her fears and her memories to become someone good and respectable, something she always doubted in herself. She wanted to start over with a clean slate, a fresh start with her new marriage, and also she spoke of motherhood. In one interview, though, when she was talking about her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, she talked about their discussions of family and having children like playing pretend, like something she liked the idea of at times, but seemed to know it was not going to be her reality. I feel like the same thing was happening with Miller. He was talented, no doubt, but he wasn't really putting his skills to much use, and she was supporting him while he was pushing to have more control over every aspect of her life and career.
In April of 1957, after having seen a later cut of her most recent film, she was angry. She wrote to Jack Warner, Here is an excerpt of that. And I am afraid that it stands that it will not be as successful as the version all of us agreed was so fine. Especially in the first third of the picture, the pacing has been slowed and one comic point after another has been flattened out by substituting inferior takes with flatter performances, lacking the energy and brightness that you saw in New York. Some of the jump cutting kills the points, as in the fainting scenes. The coronation is as long as before, if not longer, and the story gets lost in it. American audiences are not as moved by stained glass windows as the British are, and we threaten them with boredom. I am amazed that so much of the picture has no music at all when the idea was to make a romantic picture. We have shot enough film to make a great movie. If only it will be as in the earlier version. I hope that you will make every effort to save our picture." End quote. It sounds to me, reading the biographies, that Arthur had pretty much convinced her that she needed to break all ties with Milton Green. So she pretty much implied that he recut the film against her wishes in order to seal the deal and sever the relationship and his role with the company altogether. That same month, she announced the purge of all the aforementioned employees of MMP and their replacement, who were all in some manner friends of Arthur's. So the company, he just wanted to get rid of Arthur, so he just fired, or kind of just made Arthur mad on purpose and then fired all his friends.
And convinced her that he was doing things that were not beneficial to her.
Okay, so he was behind Arthur's back, talking
Yes.
to Marilyn, getting in her head, and then he pushed him out of the film and fired all of his friends at the studio.
So what it sounds like is that the recut that she wrote the letter about really wasn't all that dissimilar, but she kind of nitpicked it and made it sound like he went through and re-edited it after the first screening and changed it to a way that she didn't like, and she used that to cut him out of the company. Of course, she was president. I don't know that she really needed an excuse to, fire everybody in her company, but I think it made her feel better about it.
I think, yeah, it gave her like a platform so she didn't look as bad or feel as bad. She convinced herself.
Or make her feel like she's just letting her husband take control, which it sounds like she was struggling with, but felt like that's what she needed to do. Like she needed to be loyal to him. And he was just taking over and taking control of things while also not doing his job. And she was financially supporting him. Playwrights, No,
I don't. I don't know any of those.
Writers.
Okay, I know some of those.
Yeah.
Melodramatic. Okay, yes. I was screwing up thinking that she fired all of Arthur's friends, but she replaced the people she fired with Arthur's friends.
Yeah.
Got ya. Okay. That was just my bad. Sorry.
So in 1959, Monroe starred in one of my favorite films of all time, Some Like It Hot. So much so that I went to California, jumped on a ferry to Coronado with my friend Casey to sneak into the hotel where the movie was filmed and spend the day on the private beach during someone's wedding. We pretty much took a full tour of the hotel that we weren't supposed to be in, and the hotel itself has its own mystery that I hope to cover in a future episode. It's a really cool story. Maybe even while staying in the hotel. But it's really expensive, so probably not. So anyway, this film won Marilyn the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Comedy. If you haven't seen the movie, I suggest you put it on your list.
In 1960, she became founding member of the Hollywood branch of the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and in the same year, she was elected as an alternate delegate to the Connecticut Democratic Caucus.
I couldn't really find any information on what she did on those committees or what those committees accomplished.
Now, is this kind of the first time she's really getting into the politics side of things?
She really is getting more verbose about it. I think she's building a lot of confidence with the ideals, or she's been completely brainwashed by Arthur Miller. But I feel like he instilled a confidence in her voice, so she felt better about speaking out and getting active in politics where she hadn't really been before.
But this is the first time?
Yes.
Okay. Outside of that, Marilyn Monroe's FBI declassified file is littered with memos and reports detailing her day-to-day interactions, seemingly innocent interactions with friends. As far as the FBI offices who had her under constant surveillance were concerned, she was surrounded by and deeply involved with communists and communist sympathizers. Honestly, based on their observations and reports of people who were close to her who were giving the FBI this information, she was pretty deep in it. Whether she knew how deep, who knows. Thank goodness for Sharpies. Otherwise, this research might have been easier to put together. Get it? Redactions. Marilyn Monroe's final project to reach completion began this year, a screenplay written by her husband, Arthur Miller. One of her most well-known films, The Misfits, in which she starred alongside Clark Gable, not only did this unknowingly mark the near end of her film career, it was also the end of her third marriage, as the couple divorced in January of 1961, thus beginning an even steeper downhill spiral in Marilyn Monroe's mental health. In fact, following her separation from Miller, Monroe spent some time in a psychiatric hospital after an attempted suicide in 1960. Although she was never given an official diagnosis, it is very likely that she suffered from the same mental health ailment as her estranged mother.
In spite of her separation from suspected communist Miller, she remained under close watch in regard to her continued left-leaning political views, which is what makes the next chapter of this story even more scandalous than it already would have been. So, among the FBI documents that were declassified in the 1980s, there is a report from an unnamed, and by unnamed, I mean sharpied out, former special agent who was at the time a field representative for the governor of California's office. It sounds like the information was unsourced and the department wasn't able to verify the information, but we're going to share it anyway. So in this report, the unknown source remarks on the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, aka Bobby, having been spending a significant amount of time in Hollywood during the years 1961 and 1962. Bobby was apparently working on getting a film made of his book, which covered his work in criminal investigations, with producer Jerry Wald.
Robert Kennedy had plenty of Hollywood connections, of course, as his sister Patricia was married to Peter Lawford of the famous Rat Pack. You can find the British actor playing supporting roles in films such as Little Women, Advise and Consent, Exodus, It Should Happen to You. One could speculate that outside of his affiliation with the stars of the Rat Pack, he probably would have been a pretty obscure Hollywood name. Not to diminish his talent as an actor, just never was he the leading man. The Rat Pack was first formed under Humphrey Bogart and included Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, Cary Grant, David Niven, and Errol Flynn, Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, and Nat King Cole. After Bogart's death, the original group disbanded, but Frank Sinatra informally joined together a group of his own buddies, including Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and presumably, due to his familiar connection to the Kennedys, Peter Lawford. Why are you telling me this, you're probably asking? Well, it is important, because Frank Sinatra had a personal connection to Marilyn Monroe, and it was through Sinatra, and then through Peter Lawford, that Miss Monroe came to be associated with both Robert and John Kennedy.
Dun, dun. I thought we were going to do that together.
No, go ahead.
Do it together.
Dun,
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 dun.
dun.
That was harmonious.
That was. But first, let's talk about the connections between the Rat Pack and the Mafia, because to me, this adds a whole new dynamic to their relationship with both the Attorney General and the President of the United States. Sinatra's FBI file is pretty much a guide to the who's who of organized crime for dummies. Sinatra always denied that he was in any way tied to the mob, even though he was very good friends with famous Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Friends with famous Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, which he brought into John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960 in order to garner Union votes. In exchange for this favor, Sinatra played a gig at Giancana's Chicago club. According to a statement by Giancana's daughter Tina, that was far from the only mob connection. But we're not going to delve too deep into that. I just wanted to toss in a little tidbit. Sinatra and Monroe, who had dated for a brief period, and it sounds like they maintained somewhat of a friendship afterward. But let's get back to the FBI report.
According to this report, Lawford and his wife had introduced Bobby Kennedy to Marilyn Monroe and had arranged meetings for them at their own home. This report dishes on a deep emotional and romantic connection between Bobby Kennedy and Monroe, repeatedly promising her that he would divorce his wife to marry her.
In another memo to the FBI director from Legat, Mexico, unnamed or sharpied sources who were very closely associated to Marilyn spent a lot of time in her close proximity, reported on her activities during a trip to Mexico in February of 1962. This trip was of note to the FBI as it places Monroe in a loose social association with members or former members of what the FBI refers to as ACGM, or the American Communist Group in Mexico. According to the documents, she traveled from Miami to Mexico on February 21st as arranged by Frank Sinatra through former President Miguel Aleman. In this memo, the informant, who appears to be Monroe's interior decorator as well as assistant to her analyst, therapist Dr. Wexley, Eunice Churchill, described to the FBI agent that Monroe developed an infatuation with a man whose name is blacked out in the official release documents, but has been identified as Frederick Vanderbilt Field, on the trip and agreed to accompany said male to Toluca, Mexico on 2/23/62 during the trip. It sounds as though the rest of her entourage were less than thrilled with the developing romance with Field, a self-imposed exile who was described as having been a friend of her ex-husband, Arthur Miller.
Field was living in Mexico with his wife, having been disinherited from his wealthy family over his leftist views. In 1951, he was secretary of the Bail Fund of the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization which had been designated to a communist front by the Attorney General. During this time, Field was convicted of contempt of court for refusing to reveal who had posted bond for 4 communists who had jumped bail. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail. He served 2 months for the offense. 2 years later, he moved to Mexico and took up archaeology.
It sounds like Monroe was severely traumatized by Arthur Miller's recent nuptials to an Austrian photographer whom he met on the set of The Misfits, a film he had written for Monroe before their divorce. On the notation marked February 25th of 1962, the declassified memo regarding the Mexico trip is reported that Monroe had gone to a party the previous night at the home of Emilio Fernandez, an actor or director. You can find pictures of them enjoying tequila shots together on the interwebs. On the 25th, she was scheduled to have a date with her secret mister, but she called and canceled right before he was supposed to pick her up, and he was apparently really angry about it. According to this report, Monroe had spent time with Bobby Kennedy at the home of his brother-in-law prior to this Mexico trip, and at this point, I'm unsure how deep in romance she was with Kennedy, as she was so interested in Field, which was a match encouraged and arranged by her friends in New York, but frowned upon by the friends that went with her to Mexico. Apparently, at some point before coming home from this trip, she hit a low point, called her ex Sinatra to come and comfort her, and he refused.
Monroe left Mexico on the 2nd of March and headed back to Los Angeles. Sometime between March and May, Monroe had the pleasure of being invited back to the home of Peter Lawford. Only this time, it was President John F. Kennedy with whom she was having a luncheon. So it sounds like Lawford was pretty well known for arranging meetings for both Kennedy brothers and a multitude of ladies. On this particular occasion, Marilyn felt pretty proud of herself for the serious conversation and political questions that she had posed to the president during their interaction. Prior to this particular meeting, Lawford had already asked Monroe to appear at the president's 45th birthday party on May 19th of that year.
Monroe was in the process of filming Something's Gotta Give, but she was becoming more and more unreliable. She was often sick, missing days on end of filming. So she was already pretty famous for, or pretty notorious for being late for shoots and being difficult to film with, but it was getting much, much worse. So when she did show up to the set, she had to be coaxed from her trailer. On the week of the performance of the president's birthday, she had been absent from the film set for a majority of the time. Still, she mustered the ability to fly to New York for the celebration. She appeared wearing a flesh-colored rhinestone dress that she had to be sewn into, and sung her way into infamy with a sultry rendition of Happy Birthday, which pissed off 20th Century Fox in spectacular fashion. In an interview, Marilyn discusses having been invited to sing for the president.
In June of 1962, just after Monroe turned 36 years old, she was fired from the film Something's Gotta Give for, quote, spectacular absenteeism and, quote, willful violation of contract, for which she was sued for the sum of $750,000.
Ouch.
That's a lot back then. It's a lot now. It had been discussed that the studio panicked because it was also losing money with the film Cleopatra, which was filming at the same time, and Elizabeth Taylor's salary was 10 times that of Monroe's. The studio was hemorrhaging funds, and in an ironic turn of events, something had to give. It ended up being the lesser of the two films.
Get it?
Yeah.
Because something's gotta give.
Dean Martin refused to finish the film without Monroe, and when the studio attempted to replace her in her role, eventually her contract was renegotiated, and they were to restart filming in October.
In another of the FBI file documents, it was detailed that upon being fired from the film set, Monroe made a phone call from her home in California to Robert Kennedy, person to person, at the Department of Justice in D.C. to tell him the bad news. He consoled her, telling her not to worry about it and he would take care of it. When he didn't, she called again. This exchange is reported in the document to have been an unpleasant one, with threats being made on her part to go public with their affair.
Oh, dang.
Oh, dang.
According to her biographer, James Spada, in an interview with People in 2012, quote, it was pretty clear that Marilyn had sexual relations with both Bobby and Jack. According to Spada, actor Peter Lawford introduced Monroe to JFK in 1954, but there were some witnesses who suggested that Jack met Marilyn through her agent, Charles Feldman, as early as 1951, his first year as a senator, which was the year he met Jacqueline Bouvier. Arthur James, who knew Marilyn from her liaison with Charlie Chaplin Jr., alleges an affair between Monroe and John F. Kennedy as early as 1954, in the declining months of Marilyn's marriage to Joe DiMaggio. At the time, he was senator and not well known enough that he couldn't get by with anonymity in Hollywood. It's not clear how long the affair went on. Pete Summers, a Kennedy political strategist, met Marilyn in Kennedy's company several times at the Lawford House in early 1960, as the Kennedy presidential campaign went into high gear. Summers is quoted as saying they were very close friends. I would say that she was a very special guest. The president was really very, very fond of Marilyn. She was delightful, a little bit nervous perhaps, but I think the nervousness was because she was in a new territory with people who were political animals.
Animals. One rumor is that in the spring of 1962, when Jack Kennedy tired of her, he passed her off to his brother Bobby. This, of course, would have been around the time of their confirmed sighting together at the Lawford home. There were people with different stories to tell, though. According to a 1985 Florida Sentinel article, Senator George Smathers, if you recall, he was the senator that Mary Jo Kopechne was working for prior to joining Bobby's campaign, made the statement that he heard about Marilyn from John Kennedy himself of the affair. Smathers said, quote, "I never did believe that Jack Kennedy had a big deal going with Marilyn Monroe until after Bobby. He took her away from Bobby. Something like that. Jack would take a girl away from his brother or a friend for a short relationship at any time." End quote. So he alleges that Bobby was with Marilyn before Jack, and then other people say that she had a long-term affair with John Kennedy or Jack before Bobby. So there's a lot of kind of discrepancy there. There is indeed a lot of compelling evidence which leads one to believe that Marilyn was almost certainly involved with both Kennedy brothers. For the president, she may have been just another fling, but it sounds like, for Robert, the commitment and emotional involvement may have been much more.
According to an interview with People, former Secret Service agent in the Kennedys' detail, Jerry Blaine, said that he was with JFK during 2 known encounters the president had with Monroe, one at Lawford's Santa Monica home in 1961 and another at a party in New York following the Happy Birthday performance. According to Blaine, quote, "He probably thanked her for singing, but they weren't alone." He goes on to say that, quote, "He never saw any evidence of an affair, but I don't know what happened behind closed doors," end quote.
I was honored when they asked me to appear at Madison Square Garden. You
after having had Happy Birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way. Did you meet Kennedy?
According to Peter Lawford's third wife, Deborah Gold, Lawford broke down one night and told her that as she understood it, quote, "Robert Kennedy's involvement started when he went to Marilyn as his brother's messenger boy to say that the relationship with the president could not continue. Marilyn took it quite bad, and Bobby went away with the feeling of wanting to get to know her better. At the beginning, it was just to help and console, but then it led to an affair between Marilyn and Bobby. From what Peter told me, he fell head over heels." End quote. Whichever way it went, both Kennedys had a lot to lose in the wake of this affair going public. Her threats to do so were pretty dangerous.
Among the rumors of romance between she and the Kennedy brothers, according to the book Norma Jean, The Life of Marilyn Monroe, published in 1969, was that Monroe was admitted under an alias to a Hollywood hospital on July 20th of 1962 to abort a pregnancy. It's easy to assume, of course, that the baby could have been either Jack or Bobby's, as her last tryst with Jack had been only 3 months before the hospitalization, and she had been with Bobby as recently as a few weeks prior. Of course, she had also had other rumored lovers at the time. She seems to be unrealistically invested in the idea of Bobby, however.
On Saturday, August 4th, 1962, at around 5:15 p.m., she spoke with Dr. Ralph Greenson for about an hour on the phone. According to her obituary published in the Los Angeles Times in 1962, quote, "was told to go for a ride when she complained she could not sleep," police reported, end quote. He thought she was going to go to the beach for some fresh air. She was struggling and seeking help. What happened the next night, Sunday, August 5th, is up for debate. Some claim that a call was made to Robert F. Kennedy from Monroe begging him not to end the relationship. An article in the FBI archives details that he told her he would never leave his wife and it was over between them, and then hung up on her. Upset and crying, she took a handful of sleeping pills. Her housekeeper reports seeing her last around 8 p.m. Sunday night and noticed her bedroom light was still on till around 3:25 a.m. when she went to check on her. She found Monroe face down with the phone in hand, the empty pill bottle beside her. In the wee hours of August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was dead. One of the last calls, strangely, would be to the police.
There are other theories that her last call was not to Bobby himself, but to Peter Lawford. In one version of this theory, she called Lawford, who tried to convince her to come to a party at his house, as he was concerned that she had taken something. She asked him to say goodbye to Pat Newcomb, her personal secretary, say goodbye to the president, and she said, "Say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy," and then she drifted off. At which point he became concerned and began making phone calls.
I think, according to that theory, the first call that he made was to a lawyer, who then called her psychiatrist and then her physician, her private physician. So those were all calls that were made before the police.
Probably wasn't wise.
So in another version, she was furious that the brothers both tossed her aside in an effort to maintain their public images. She was angry in the end, wanting revenge. Her biographer Lois Banner published that, quote, she was planning on holding a press conference the next Monday and reveal what the Kennedys had done to her. She told Peter, quote, "You tell him," meaning Bobby, "that if he doesn't fly down to see me and talk things over, he'll hear from me at my press conference Monday morning. It'll make headlines around the world, although not the kind that would help Jack's bid for re-election." End quote. According to biographer Danforth Prince, Marilyn told Peter that if Bobby didn't come to her home and meet with her in person on August 4th by 6 p.m., that both men should, quote, tune in to her planned announcement days later. She also threatened that, quote, "You might also call Jack at the White House. I know he has a busy schedule, but he'll have time to watch me. I plan to look dazzling." End quote.
Thad Brown, a Los Angeles chief detective, was reported to have told the U.S. Treasury's assistant chief of intelligence in Los Angeles that they had found a crumpled piece of paper amidst Marilyn's sheets. On that was a number for the White House. Apparently, it was determined that she had called John Kennedy just before she died.
Thus born was the theory that her death was carefully planned and conspired. Peter Lawford knew that Marilyn had a history of faking suicide attempts to gain attention, and is reported to have made special arrangements with her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, whom she had called just a day before her death. On her last visit to him, he prescribed 60 Seconal tablets, which are sleeping pills, which was an unusual quantity, especially since he saw her so frequently. The night that she died, her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, put the bottle of pills on the night table, feeding the theory that the housekeeper, who was frequently named as an informant in FBI documents, and Marilyn's personal secretary and press agent Pat Newcomb were in on the plan.
The theory that the people close to her were in on it seems pretty within reach when you look at what happened after the fact. Investigators found that the housekeeper ended up in Europe less than 2 weeks after the death of Monroe. Detective Becky Altringer spoke with Pat Newcomb, who was 88 years old at the time, and asked her if she was sent out of the country by the Kennedys, and Newcomb's response was, "I was leaving anyway."
88 years old at the time of the interview, not at the time of Monroe's death.
Right. Conveniently, Newcomb suddenly found herself in a high executive position during Bobby Kennedy's 1964 campaign, and then later a senior position at MGM Studios.
According to White House records, on the day that Monroe died, the president and his wife were vacationing in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, so he wouldn't have received the call at the White House even if there had been one. There are, however, no records of where Bobby Kennedy was. There are rumors that he had a hotel room in Hollywood and visited the starlet the night before she died, and they argued.
On top of all these strange happenings, there seems to have been a strange disappearance of some key physical evidence in the death investigation. Police records disappeared, phone records disappeared, 4 sets of tapes from reported bugs in her house also mysteriously disappeared. That also seems to be a Kennedy theme. Controversial
private investigator Fred Otash claimed to have had surveillance and bugs in her place and heard the last moments of her life recorded. He had transcripts of the tapes that he had typed while he was listening to the tapes, but then the tapes were gone. He had also claimed that he had bugged Lawford's house and had recordings of she and the president in very intimate moments, but never released those either. With all the controversy surrounding Bobby Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover with illegal wiretapping and bugging to spy on the suspects of their Red Scare witch hunt, I find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be any tapes. She had been under FBI surveillance since 1955.
After she was discovered by the housekeeper, the psychiatrist Greenson was the first person called, followed by her personal physician,
who has the coolest name ever,
Dr. Hyman Engelberg. Greenson arrived at the house at 3:40 a.m. and at 3:50 a.m., Engelberg arrived and pronounced the 36-year-old dead. It would be another 35 minutes before the police were called. Gianni Russo, who played a role in the film The Godfather, was deeply involved in the mob with which JFK was associated, and he has a lot to say on the matter, including the pregnancy, Monroe's threats to take the affair public prior to her death, and that her death was orchestrated, and that she was murdered by a physician who was also used by the mob. You can find the video in a list of our references.
So he said that she was still alive when they found her, actually, and that the physician injected a syringe full of air.
They just went ahead
and just finished her off.
Oh.
The man who would perform the autopsy, Dr. Noguchi, would later describe a fresh bruise on her hip.
Wasn't Dr. Noguchi Robert Kennedy's autopsy? It was.
What?
He did the autopsy. Dr. Noguchi also did Robert Kennedy's autopsy. It's so weird. Key players.
When he examined Monroe's stomach, he found no traces of the dye that coated the capsules that were supposed to have claimed her life. He did make a statement in the interview that he should have tested her internal organs instead of just performing toxicology tests on the blood and liver. Quote, "I'm sure that this could have cleared up a lot of the subsequent controversy, but I didn't follow through as I should have," end quote. According to an interview that he did with the Telegraph in 2009, quote, "I think that was a great shame. Not suspicious. I'm not saying that. It was a perfectly normal procedure, but still a shame," end quote. Her death was ruled probable suicide, officially.
Miss Monroe has suffered from psychiatric disturbance for a long time. Mood changes were abrupt and unpredictable. In our investigation, we have learned that Miss Monroe had often expressed wishes to give up, to withdraw, and even to die. On more than one occasion in the past, when disappointed and depressed, she had made a suicide attempt using sedative drugs. On the basis of all the information obtained, it is our opinion that the case is a probable suicide.
You can listen to an interview in which one of the embalmers discusses experiences preparing her for her burial. It isn't really laden with much evidence of conspiracy, but they did have a lot of difficulty trying to keep the embalming private. 20th Century Fox was called to provide privacy curtains in the chapel, as well as providing a professional makeup artist to do her makeup. She was buried in the wig that she wore for most of her recent films.
Also in that interview, I wasn't going to include it because it's freaking weird, but one of the guys that was called to help with the embalming kind of described her physical condition, but then also described that he brought his wife in because she was a big fan to let her see the body, which they snuck around to do, and Joe DiMaggio stayed for almost the whole time until he absolutely had to leave, and then he snuck his wife in after Joe DiMaggio left. And also, he snagged her falsies, her like silicone breast falsies that she wore to kind of keep herself perky after 30, you know? But he stole those and accidentally, when he grabbed those out of the trash, grabbed a lock of hair that had come off when they were doing some sewing on the back of her neck. So he had a lock of hair and her false breast that he took as souvenirs for his wife. Anyway, in the end, it was her ex-husband Joe DiMaggio who came back to take care of her. Her funeral arrangements were made and paid for by DiMaggio, snubbing the Hollywood production and the famous names. He opted only to allow a few personal friends, although to watch the footage, there are camera crews and photographers all over the place. Arrangements were made for bouquets of red roses to be placed at her final resting place 3 times a week for the next 20 years. Or so it said. I do not know that for sure.
Even now, the rumors and theories regarding her death continue to spin from the pens and lips of people who are skeptical of the official story. There have been newspaper articles which were watched and kept by the FBI in her file long after her death and likely won't disappear anytime soon. Much like the so-called conspiracy theories about some of the more famous political figures with whom her fate seemed to intertwine.
Who let you in?
Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper. She became very concerned and called Dr. Greenson, who lived just a few minutes away.
And what, if anything, did you ask Dr. Greenson?
I asked, since this all occurred shortly after midnight, And the call came to me at 4:25 a.m. I asked why it took 4 hours to call the police.
What was the response, if any, from Dr. Greenson?
Well, Dr. Greenson finally spoke up and he said they had to get permission from the publicity department of the studio before they could notify anybody.
Do you have any theory as to what happened in this instance?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
Marilyn Monroe was murdered.
Thank you again for joining us for another piece of our Kennedy Curse series. Stay tuned for the last and final piece, the pinnacle, the climax, the main event, if you will. Don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you are listening from. And if you're feeling super generous, please leave us a good rating and a review. And if you really want to love and support your favorite indie podcast, find us on Patreon. If you want to contact us, you can do so via email to bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, Facebook message, or you can call us at 641-891-2635. Leave us a voicemail and we'll play it on the next episode. Don't forget to find us on Instagram and Twitter. And thanks for listening and supporting all indie podcasts like ours. Happy birthday, Mr. President.
Come at me, bro.